This is the story of a small, little-known tropical country in Africa. The only Spanish-speaking nation on the continent, its territory was originally acquired from Portugal to facilitate Spain's slave trade. But instead, it developed as a predominantly Catholic colony with a successful agricultural economy. After a struggle, it gained independence in 1968. But the dreams of independence soon turned into a nightmare as the country was plunged into a decade of bloody, pro-communist dictatorship. The economy was ruined and half the population was killed or fled into exile. Even after the dictator was deposed, the country struggled to recover from ruination and poverty. Only after oil was discovered in the 1990s did its fortunes change for the better. And today, 50 years after independence, the country enjoys the highest literacy rate in Africa and is one of the most developed countries on the continent. This is a story of triumph over adversity in Africa. This is the story of Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is located on the west coast of Central Africa. It is blessed by rich, fertile soil, abundant rain, rivers, waterfalls, forests, diverse fauna and flora, and a wide expanse of the Gulf of Guinea. The national territory includes a slice of continental Africa wedged between Gabon and Cameroon called Rio Muni, as well as two volcanic islands, Bioko and Annobon, and three smaller islands, Corisco, El Bay Grande, and El Bay Chico, as well as several islets. Portuguese explorers discovered Bioko in 1471 and Annobon in 1472. But after 300 years of minimal development, ceded the islands and the adjacent continental coast to Spain, giving Madrid direct access to the African slave trade and labor for its American plantations. However, Spain's initial efforts at colonization failed, and only a century later, when a sustained missionizing effort was undertaken by the Barcelona-based Catholic Claretian order, did Spanish colonization begin in earnest. Catholic missionizing spread to the continent in 1907, and by the 1950s, Equatorial Guinea was 90% Catholic, the highest in Africa.
Venir a misiones no significa solo.
And of course, coming as a missionary here didn't just mean preaching the gospel and celebrating Mass, but was also a process of formation that we now call integral evangelization, educating people so that they can become a new person in Christ. They started with education at all levels.
In 1900, the Treaty of Paris between France and Spain settled the modern boundaries of Equatorial Guinea. Nevertheless, Spain only took full control of Bioko by 1910 and Rio Muni by 1926. In the 1900s, Spain developed infrastructure and plantations, primarily for growing cocoa and general agriculture on Bioko, as well as cocoa and coffee on Rio Muni. A timber industry was developed on the continent. From 1926 until 1959, Spain called its colony Spanish Guinea.
Spanish colonists had a law that considered all Equatorial Guineans to be minors, both socially and legally, no matter their age. There was this other category called emancipados. The emancipated were those Equatorial Guineans who were granted some degree of social integration, because there was a type of apartheid, although it was not called that. There were some places for whites and other places for blacks.
The captain commanding the district ordered all the cocoa trees to be cut down because he wanted coffee trees planted there. I mean, regardless of what you had worked on, you had to cut it down and start growing coffee. In your work, you were obliged to obey.
Look, we were a colony for 200 years. I mean, limited rights, limited freedom. We just couldn't have more than that. Just imagine, you needed a safe passage permit to go from one district to another.
After World War II, the spirit of national independence swept through Africa. In Spanish Guinea, too, there was a growing movement for full independence from Spain.
I should say, they shouldn't be called opposition, but fighters for independence. They fought for the independence of Equatorial Guinea so that Equatorial Guineans could decide on their own destiny.
An early opposition group was established in 1947 by African nationalists, led by Enrique Envo Okembe and Acacio Manye Ella. Manye chose to fight for independence from within the country. He was killed by the Spanish in 1958.
He loved his people, the Guineans. He was a man who had means. There was no reason to take a risk, but he took the risk for love of the country, his homeland.
Enrique Envo was also killed by the Spanish in 1959.
He said that he was going to fight for the independence of Guinea because it was now too much. The other African countries were now independent. The time had arrived for Guinea to also be independent.
To deflect international pressure and diffuse domestic resistance, on July 30th, 1959, Spain officially made Spanish Guinea part of Spain proper, with Bioko and Rio Muni recognized as Spanish provinces.
As a Spanish province, political activity was forbidden, even more because a Spaniard was not allowed to be against Spain. Otherwise, you would lose your scholarship. You would be dismissed from school.
Independence activities now coalesced around three main groups established in exile.
When people started to talk about politics, they would go into exile to be free to speak up because we weren't allowed to do it here. There used to be complete repression. Afterwards, we were granted autonomous status, and it was then that all the parties came out of the shadows.
After 4 years as provinces of Spain, the basic law for autonomy of the two provinces was passed by the Spanish Parliament and adopted by a referendum in Equatorial Guinea on December 15, 1963. Autonomy went into effect on January 1, 1964, and the colony was now called Equatorial Guinea. In May 1964, Munhe, a party backed by Spain, won elections. Its leader, Bonifacio Ondo Edu, was made president of the governing council. But pressure to grant full independence continued to mount on Spain.
At the beginning, this process was democratic. There was a constitutional conference in Spain in which all Equatorial Guinean political leanings participated.
A mi modo de ver, la primera constitución de Guinea Ecuatorial.
In my opinion, the first constitution of Equatorial Guinea was created rather hastily, but it was balanced. In the Constitution of '68, we can find the seed of protection of rights because the Constitution refers to the rights related to, for instance, the freedoms of association, trade unions, cooperatives, worship, and belief.
On August 11, 1968, 64% of Equatorial Guineans voted to approve the Constitution. But some were opposed, including supporters of the Bubi Union Party. Many Bubis benefited from Spanish economic activities on Bioko, and some supported an effort to make the island a separate state.
I think it is worth noting that in Equatorial Guinea, no great popular action or revolutionary struggle or armed conflict were necessary to achieve independence.
On September 22nd, a general election was held for members of the National Assembly and President, with UN supervision.
I think we did something that wasn't even achieved in Spain. Fully democratic elections. It was a hard-fought election for all participating parties.
Voting for the 35-seat National Assembly produced a fairly even distribution of seats among the parties. There were 4 candidates in the first round of the presidential vote. Francisco Macías and Gema, the most stridently anti-Spain candidate, came in first. Bonifacio Ondo Edu, favored by Spain, came in second.
The people didn't want continuity with the Spanish because of the things they already knew. Macías was promising to disentangle us completely from Spain, and that the government would be ours.
In a runoff election on September 29th, Macías won with 62% of the votes. Finally then, the stage was set for the formal declaration of independence and the handover ceremony at noon on October 12, 1968. Spain was represented by Manuel Fraga, Spain's Minister of Information and Tourism.
In the name of the head of state of Spain, I transfer power to the President of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea and his people. Long live Equatorial Guinea.
Como guineano, a mí esto me sentó muy bien.
As a Guinean, it felt very good because in those days many countries were gaining independence.
Recibiendo la independencia.
Todos nosotros anhelábamos ser independientes.
We all yearned to be independent. For Equatorial Guinea, it was something glorious.
Que me decían que el pueblo de Israel.
I remember in theology lessons, I learned that the people of Israel suffered slavery in Egypt, and then again in Babylon. On each of these occasions, the nation needed its independence.
La independencia.
I can say that until today, it has left a legacy of total independence. We feel free, not influenced by anyone. So we don't want the influence of anyone. Not Spain, not France.
On November 6th, the United Nations Security Council voted to make Equatorial Guinea the 126th UN member, a vote confirmed by the General Assembly on November 12, 1968. The excitement of celebrating newfound independence was not to last long. Soon, the fledgling democracy was plunged into oppression and dictatorship. Due to Spanish development of plantations, logging, and other economic activities, as well as investments in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, at independence, Equatorial Guinea had one of the highest per capita GDP rates in Africa. Macías, despite his strident anti-Spain rhetoric, recognized the need for continued Spanish assistance, which he asked for and received. Ironically, Macías admired the dictatorial ruling style of Franco and other fascists and communists. Early on, he showed dictatorial tendencies. Barely 3 months into his term, a crisis was already brewing. Macías claimed that losing parties in the election were hatching a coup against him with the support of Spain. He moved 7,000 Fang into Malabo to contain what he saw as a dangerous alignment of Spain with Bubi separatists. And he demanded that Spain's 240-man civil guard return home. Seeing the country's rapid descent into dictatorship and encouraged by Spain, Foreign Minister Atanasio Andong and Representative to the UN Saturnino Ibongo attempted a coup on March 5, 1969.
Otro gravísimo error que cometió España.
Another dreadful mistake of Spain was the attempted coup of March 5th. Knowing Macías' character, an utterly violent man, very narcissistic, extremely proud of himself, and above all, in love with power and with his own freedom to govern.
Amante del poder y de la libertad de gobernar él.
Both Atanasio Andong and Saturnino Ibongo were quickly arrested and executed. The coup had failed. Bonifacio Ondo Edu was also arrested and executed on March 5th as a suspected collaborator. The only electoral rival to survive was Vice President Onmundo Busillo, head of the Bubi Union. He survived a few years, but was eventually arrested and died in 1975.
Entonces, con el fracaso del golpe de Estado,
once the coup had failed, and with proof of Spain's involvement, then Macías looked at Spain as the enemy.
The regime turned on Spanish residents, forcing most to leave. There had been 7,000 Spaniards living in Equatorial Guinea at independence. By April 5, 1969, there were fewer than 100 remaining in the country. In just 6 months after independence, Equatorial Guinea had lost the bulk of its educated and professional class, and the situation was about to get much worse. As with many newly independent African countries, Macías turned for help to communist countries to replace former Western colonial masters. He established particularly close ties with the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. The Soviet Union was granted exclusive fishing rights based in Malabo and a naval base at Luba. Cuba provided teachers and medical staff, and China provided technical assistance and consumer goods.
I don't think he was ideologically a communist. It was for political reasons. He was against Spain, and he understood that Spain was the West. He was very radical about this, so he looked for help from China. China sold him all the merchandise we needed because the country lived on supplies from abroad.
Macías also used the March 5th coup attempt to advance his personal agenda to transform Equatorial Guinea into a single-party dictatorship, beginning with a bloody purge of his perceived enemies. Macías suspected members of the political opposition, his own ministers, members of the Catholic Church, and diplomats as agents of Spanish imperialism.
Empezó a haber enemigos en todo el mundo.
He started seeing enemies everywhere, so he turned on his own people.
He closed the country to the outside world and banned foreign journalists. He created the National Guard as a formal military force, and in 1970, the Popular Revolutionary Militia, which collaborated closely with the Juventud en Marcha con Macías, or Youth Marching with Macías, which itself was modeled on Franco's Falange youth movement and the Hitler Youth. The Juventud and militia were largely responsible for threats and intimidation, looting and extrajudicial arrests, torture, and murders. Among senior officials, he early on imprisoned and executed most of the pre-independence administration, 10 of 12 members of his original cabinet, and 9 of the 35-member National Assembly. Torture was brutal and widespread. Death was inflicted by starvation, beheading, firing squad, dismemberment, disease, and beatings that crushed prisoners' skulls. In 1973, 99% of voters, under duress, approved replacement of the 1968 Constitution with a new one that gave Macías absolute power and made him president for life in a single-party state. By the end of 1974, over 2/3 of the original National Assembly members had disappeared, and most of the senior civil servants had been killed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. And by the end of his rule, only 10 of the 46 representatives at the Constitutional Conference in Madrid were still alive.
Consideró que la condición de intelectual, condición de estudios, de haber hecho estudios, entonces...
He considered that being an intellectual, holding a university degree, went against his idea of the Equatorial Guinean who should run the country. And he linked it with submissiveness towards the West.
To prevent escapes, he burned the fishing boats on Bioko and mined the only road on Rio Muni connecting the country to neighboring states. To replace 45,000 Nigerian laborers who had fled the country, Macías tried to conscript 60,000 people from the continent to work on the plantations around Bioko.
There was no more cocoa. The Nigerian laborers had left. So Macías resorted to forced recruitment in the continental region. These actions greatly degraded Macías's situation.
Although Malabo was the capital, Macías moved his administration to Bata and then Mongomo. Finally, he moved the government to his village, Anzanayong, from where he ran the country for the last 5 years. After executing the head of the central bank, he removed all the government cash from the treasury to his village home.
In the meantime, it became impossible to manage the government. There were some officials in Malabo, some in Bata. Nothing worked anymore. The president was in his hometown, and the ministers did their own things.
During Macías' time in office, some 90% of public services, including mail, transport, and electricity, ground to a halt. Western medicines were banned, causing the spread of deadly diseases.
That government, the first government in the country, was incompetent. So much so that people fled.
Some of his most sinister moves were against the church. In a country where over 90% of the population was Christian, the vast majority Catholics.
Catholicism is the work of Franco. Catholicism in Equatorial Guinea has been the instrument of the colonial government to prevent people from seeing the truth. Because of that, they deceived us. Priests are not allowed to speak about politics.
In 1974, religious meetings were prohibited. Soon, all churches and private schools were closed. Priests, nuns, and missionaries were arrested, and many forced to do hard labor. The beautiful Santa Isabel Cathedral was used to warehouse Soviet-supplied weapons.
In Equatorial Guinea, there were no churches. I don't mean there weren't any, but they were closed. You couldn't celebrate anything in a church without government approval. I got married at my in-laws because we were not allowed to go into the church to get married.
In May 1978, Macías declared the country an atheist state and then expelled 7 of the last 8 Claretian missionaries. Macías combined megalomania with a cult of personality. He gave himself 46 official titles, including There is no other God than Macías and The Unique Miracle of Equatorial Guinea. In 1978, Swedish anthropologist Robert af Klitteberg went on a fact-finding tour to Equatorial Guinea and countries that held its refugees to assess the situation. He found a country in ruins, cut off from the world. He was the only guest in the capital's only hotel. He called Equatorial Guinea the concentration camp of Africa, a cottage industry Dachau. Klitteberg estimated 100,000 people went into exile, mainly to Gabon and Cameroon. In addition, thousands were killed, and 45,000 Nigerian laborers fled the country. Altogether, the pre-independence population of 300,000 was halved.
Había persecución. Y había también.
There was persecution and also poverty. There was poverty. So the people were left in a sad situation. That's why we call that time the sad memory.
Los años de Macías fueron unos años de
Macías's years were a complete disaster, a bloody regime without a hint of respect for the law. No law prevailed. Macías's wishes were the law and Guineans were hopeless.
Equatorial Guinea was in ruins. The dream of independence had turned into a nightmare. As Vice Minister of the Armed Forces, Obiang Nguema knew that dissatisfaction with the regime was widespread and growing.
El día 3 de agosto de 1979, de verdad, yo no pude esconder.
On August 3rd, 1979, really, I couldn't hide my excitement when they told me something had happened that would change the situation.
Algo que va a cambiar esta situación.
El cambio que hemos dado el nombre de golpe de libertad.
The freedom coup, we call it. Society as a whole, which expected a good government that would satisfy the people, found an irrational system that didn't respect people.
Empezaron a encontrar un sistema irracional, un sistema que no respetaba a las personas.
Estos extremos
The people endured the extremism of Macías up to a certain point.
hicieron que el pueblo pues
Then they just turned their back on him.
Cuando empezó
When civil disobedience started, it turned into a great protest.
es una desobediencia civil que se convirtió en una gran manifestación. Y muchos compañeros militares también se
And many military men joined the protest, and we started to fight the regime, putting an end to a bloody regime.
cuando se producen los hechos de 70.
Equatorial Guinea was about to disappear as a country when the coup of '79 took place. I witnessed Cameroon and Nigeria considering dividing up our country.
Ya estaban pensando en repartirse el país.
Macías did not go quietly. He still enjoyed the support of some loyalists, and some of his soldiers died before he was captured on August 18, 1979, while trying to flee to Gabon. The situation in the country was desperate. There was almost no food. The economy was ruined. Tens of thousands had fled to other countries, including virtually all of the educated class. Jails were full of political prisoners. Schools and churches were closed.
La estrategia era primeramente hacer un llamamiento a toda la población.
The strategy, primarily, was to call all the people to put an end to the repression. For instance, churches were closed. We had to issue an executive order to open the churches.
Nosotros tuvimos que hacer un decreto para abrir las iglesias.
For those who were imprisoned, there were many, we had to issue another executive order to free everyone.
These steps were taken immediately, followed soon after by decrees granting amnesty to all in exile and returning private property to its rightful owners.
Fue una sorpresa para mí y para mis compañeros.
It was a surprise for me and my companions to think that power was in our hands, because we were not prepared to be leaders. The first thing we had to do was to call all civil servants, all professionals, to see how we could establish an administration, a regime that would work for the people. Based on those meetings, the Supreme Military Council was organized.
La administración del gobierno del Consejo Militar Supremo.
On September 24th, Macías was brought before a special military tribunal in Malabo to face charges under Spanish law, including mass murder, embezzlement, and treason. The trial was held in public. International observers judged it fair. On September 29th, Macías and 6 of his 10 co-defendants most closely associated with atrocities were sentenced to death. They were executed by firing squad that evening. The country embarked on a decade of struggle to rebuild the economy and overcome extreme poverty. Equatorial Guinea had gone from being one of the most successful economies in Africa to being one of the worst. The new president initially turned to Spain.
Spain has the moral and international responsibility to help Equatorial Guinea at this critical time. As the mother country, we presented the most pressing needs in all sectors to the Spanish government.
I believe we will never be able to say we are completely separate from Spain, because traditionally, it is our place in Europe.
King Juan Carlos visited in December 1979 to show support for the new government. One of the main requests of the new government was for Spain to support the local currency, the Equele, formerly the pesete guineana, which had little value without convertibility.
But Spain never helped the country in the way the president asked. In order to give their support, they wanted to make decisions on Guinea's economic programs.
In 1979, Equatorial Guinea was in ruins. In the 80s, the country could barely pay its government salaries. I'm not talking about meeting the basic obligations of the state and needs of its citizens, much less building needed infrastructure.
I
arrived in Guinea in 1980. In those days, Malabo was almost a ghost town. It was empty. There was a very small population, low levels of activity, a dearth of resources. At the same time, there was a euphoric atmosphere for our regained freedom.
Spain did continue to provide aid, mainly through loans and technical assistance, despite mutual distrust between the two nations. In 1982, Pope John Paul II visited, giving great encouragement to the largely Catholic country. In the meantime, President Obiang sought assistance from around the world, and several countries, multilateral organizations, and international charities provided much-needed aid. In December 1983, Equatorial Guinea joined the Customs and Economic Union of Central Africa, or UDEAC, facilitating trade with 5 neighboring Francophone African countries. And in 1999, it was a founding member of CEMAC, which replaced UDEAC as a regional economic group. In 1985, Equatorial Guinea joined the Central African Franc Currency Zone.
It is not only in use within our national territory, but by being accepted in third countries, it opens new possibilities to develop the nation in close collaboration with other countries.
Aid flows from multilaterals and donor countries increased through the decade, reaching about half of Equatorial Guinea's GDP. Despite this assistance, the economy actually shrank 4 out of the 10 years between 1981 and 1991. The first attempt at full democracy, at independence, had resulted in disaster. The 1980s witnessed a gradual restoration of democratic institutions and the rule of law.
Democracy is a process that we must perfect over time. We can't compare the democracy we have now with what we announced to the people at the beginning.
Con la democracia que empezamos a predicar al pueblo.
We have had many elections and we improve little by little.
In 1982, a new constitution, or basic law, was approved by 95% of the voters.
In 1982, the Acanibe Carta was adopted. That was also, in my opinion, a well-balanced constitution. After 1982, the Constitution would be amended many times.
On July 4, 1986, a law was adopted that called for the creation of a single party. This would be the Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea, which has remained in power since. On November 19, 1991, a national referendum approved a revised constitution, which allowed for multiple parties. On January 6, 1992, a general amnesty was issued for all political prisoners, and freedom of assembly and protest was granted.
The implementation of democratic changes, the respect for human rights, the struggle to restore the rule of law, I believe all of this went hand in hand with international movements or events, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the wave of democratization that started in Eastern European countries, continued through to Africa, and finally included Equatorial Guinea.
During the Macías era, there had been unsuccessful exploration for oil by international companies. When President Obiang took power, he initially turned to Spain to help find oil.
Se creó una compañía, se llamaba HEPSA.
He created a company called HEPSA, composed of Hispanoil and Guinea's government.
Hispanoil por un lado y el gobierno de Guinea por otro lado. Y como
And the Guinean government allowed HEPSA to explore all of the country's territorial waters.
Marítima de las aguas territoriales de Guinea Ecuatorial a HEPSA para explorar petróleo.
Se hicieron exploraciones del norte al sur.
Spanish companies explored for 10 years, north to south. The French also carried out explorations, and in the end, they informed us that there was no oil in Equatorial Guinea. I said that was not true. They didn't want Guinea, my regime, and specifically me, to benefit from oil revenues to develop the country. That's why I personally flew to the United States, following the advice of the American ambassador, Chester Norris.
The person President Obiang found in Houston was Joseph Walter, the head of exploration company Walter International.
In the same field where the Spanish had explored for 10 years, they found oil in 6 months.
Hoy es un día histórico.
This is a historic day, an important day for the people of Equatorial Guinea. I say historic because it is the first time in the history of Equatorial Guinea that we have achieved the commercial production of oil.
In 1995, Mobil Oil discovered the offshore Zafiro field with reserves of 1.2 billion barrels. By 1996, oil and gas production took off.
It was a big challenge, but we did achieve in a shorter period than any one of the other countries what some of them have not done before. The production peak around 2005, 2007. At that point, it was close to 420,000 barrels per day equivalent. Our plan is to have a sustainable production of 300,000 barrels per day equivalent. That's our target. In 2-3 years period, we'll be in a situation of maintaining that production plan that we have.
Oil and gas revenues dramatically increased GDP from $281 million in 1995 to $22.7 billion in 2008.
I believe the impact has been very positive. I am not an economist or a development planner, but I believe oil revenues have been very well invested in a way that has not been done in other countries.
Forced abroad during the Spanish colonial period and Macías era, the political opposition has increasingly become part of the domestic political scene during the Obiang era.
Son instituciones que, tienen como finalidad.
Our institutions are aimed at guaranteeing broad participatory democracy. There have recently been reforms aimed at widening the participation of the people by creating a second chamber in parliament, together with establishing an ombudsman institution.
La oposición es un sentimiento natural.
Opposition is a natural feeling of people who disagree with our governing style.
Con la forma que nosotros gobernamos. Por lo tanto, están...
So they have legitimate feelings, and we always try to reach out, to invite the opposition, to introduce their ideas, and see if, together with our ideas, we can organize a democracy, a regime that satisfies the people of Equatorial Guinea.
Una democracia, un régimen que satisfaga al pueblo de Guinea Ecuatorial.
A dialogue was organized, including the diaspora opposition.
A mí, con raras excepciones.
In my opinion, with some rare exceptions, political opposition in exile doesn't seem serious. It doesn't appear credible. They say they are opponents of the dictatorial regime in Equatorial Guinea, but say they can't come back here as opposition until Guinea is a democracy.
In October 2014, President Obiang signed a decree that granted amnesty to opposition leaders at home and abroad, including those previously convicted of crimes. The following month, a national dialogue between the government and opposition parties resulted in changes to the law that were wanted by the opposition. 12 parties signed the final agreement.
Our Constitution states specifically that we are a state of laws, in which individual liberties constitute the basis of the state, the basis of society.
La oposición para que pueda trabajar.
For the opposition to work and make positive contributions to political, social, and economic changes in the country, the government needs to respect their freedom to act. It means, simply put, that the government must not persecute the opposition.
As a small nation endowed with natural resources, Equatorial Guinea has also been the object of envy and the target of several attempts to take it by force. During the Macías era, there were a number of coup attempts, including one in 1973 believed to be planned and financed by British author Frederick Forsyth, later novelized in the book and film The Dogs of War. Better known was the Wanga coup attempt led by British mercenary Simon Mann in 2004. The attempted coups have made the government very security conscious. However, the country has avoided the civil wars that have been all too common in post-colonial Africa, especially in resource-rich countries. Despite suffering the growing pains of democracy, Equatorial Guinea has seen huge developments in education, healthcare, housing and infrastructure, and significant improvements in the overall quality of life.
When we came to Guinea in '87, there were very few cars and almost nothing. The change is dramatic. When we came on vacation, there was nothing. The truth is that we are all happy with the changes. The main things that have changed, the infrastructure, the hospitals, which are now a necessity. By infrastructure, I mean houses. Above all, now there are many people that have electricity, which formerly was mission impossible. And the water. These are essential needs that we must have. And now we almost have it all.
El desarrollo que estamos construyendo en el país.
Our country's development is based on the programs we have established.
Primero, cuando Guinea.
First, when Guinea found we could produce oil, we organized an economic conference in which all sectors participated.
Económica, en el que participaron todos los sectores. Gobierno.
Government, opposition, autonomous organizations, civil society, everybody. The goal was to define how we would use oil. We have greatly developed the country's infrastructure. We are developing the administration, although it still has many shortcomings.
A decade of rapid economic growth followed.
Entonces, en el 2007, cuando nos proponemos con el gobierno.
So, in 2007, when the government proposed to organize the Second National Economic Conference, the question was, how will we use the revenue we earned from oil for more than a decade to make the development sustainable over time?
De este pueblo sea sostenible en el tiempo.
The development program adopted is called Horizon 2020. Schools have been increased and improved. The first university, UNHE, has been established, and according to UNESCO, the literacy rate is the highest in Africa. The Afro-American University of Central Africa has been created in Oyala to serve the country and region. New medical facilities have been built, including a mental health facility. And social housing has been expanded dramatically. The physical infrastructure has been transformed with new bridges, ports, airports, and one of the best road networks in Africa. Electricity generation has increased by 1,400%, including a hydroelectric plant at Jablo, and most of the country is connected to the grid. There are several national parks with beautiful fauna and flora. There are many fine hotels and golf courses.
No hemos llegado al paraíso.
We haven't arrived in paradise, but as regards to people's quality of life and human development, Equatorial Guinea, through Horizon 2020, has experienced significant progress.
One of the most effective health programs in the country has been a campaign to eliminate the #1 killer, malaria. The program is jointly funded by the government of Equatorial Guinea and several oil companies. This public-private program is on track to make Bioko malaria-free in a few years, with the ultimate impact extending far beyond Equatorial Guinea.
It has a significant impact on the Bioko Island, and to the point where when the project started, the prevalence of malaria on the island was around 60%, and we are talking about today with a prevalence of around 11%.
A critical piece of the project has been development of a malaria vaccine by U.S. company Scenaria. Trials of the vaccine are showing very promising results. The oil income has enabled Equatorial Guinea to modernize rapidly and position itself as a business hub for the region.
Had they taken me in 2007 to Mars and brought me back today, I would say that I'm in a totally different country. We have to produce enough to feed our markets, we have to produce enough to export, but I think the main focus should be on being a hub for services and commerce in general.
El país ha hecho muchísimo esfuerzo.
The country has made great efforts to improve our regulations precisely, to guarantee foreign investment.
One aspect of the president's vision for his country can be seen in the new administrative city at Oyala, which is both a secure location for the government as well as a place from which Equatorial Guinea can play a larger role in the region.
Besides the fact that Equatorial Guinea has a population that is well educated and trained, there is also a lot of achievement made in terms of infrastructure. The kids today are more into arts, into entrepreneurship, and also very active in civil society. That's a very important sign that the economic development is also contributing positively in our youth.
As Equatorial Guinea has developed, it has played an increasingly important role in regional and international affairs. It has used its state-of-the-art conference facilities in Sopopo, outside Malabo, to host a number of major international conferences, including African Union summits and an Africa Arab World Summit. It hosts the parliament for CEMAC, the regional economic group of 6 countries, and has provided significant support for BIAC, the group's bank. Furthermore, under President Obiang, the country has made many gestures of concrete support for African causes, including a $30 million donation to fight hunger, and hosting the 2015 Africa Cup of Nations during the Ebola crisis. It has sponsored annual UNESCO prizes in the life sciences.
So I've seen an Equatorial Guinea that was a beneficiary of humanitarian assistance, that needed help from everybody for everything, to an Equatorial Guinea that when there was the floods in Japan, they made a donation. When there was a problem in Haiti, they made a donation. When the peacekeeping force had to start in Central African Republic, the first financiers were Equatorial Guinea. When the Ebola crisis happened, they gave money to transport doctors to West Africa. So now they're thinking as a donor, what to do as a donor and how to be innovative as a donor. I recall, I think it's about 5 years ago, it was Equatorial Guinea that established a food security fund within FAO for African countries, because they wanted to make sure that the UN helped African countries first. So they put in $30 million, and then they spoke to Angola and other countries to also join in to put that fund. So instead of being a recipient, they're now thinking about how to be a donor.
Backed by the African Union, in June 2017, Equatorial Guinea was elected by 185 out of 193 UN member states to a non-permanent seat on the Security Council, an international vote of confidence for this small, once obscure African country.
Vamos a luchar contra los extremismos.
We are going to fight extremism, terrorism, rebellions, and people that practice mercenary politics. We want the world to be a haven for peace. I believe Guinea can be an international example of a peace-loving country, and that's the idea we are taking to the Security Council.
On October 12, 2018, Equatorial Guinea celebrates 50 years of independence. The dramatic transformation of the country has been most significant for those who have lived it.
There's a huge difference between colonial times and today. A huge difference.
100% se ha cambiado.
There's been a 100% change. There were no roads, no power, no drinkable water, not much, no buildings. Nothing of what you see now. This is all new.
Hopefully, all Equatorial Guineans will keep close the idea already planted, that if Equatorial Guineans don't build this country, nobody else will.
I believe that the transformation of the country in these 50 years is positive, in spite of the difficulties. For Guineans are, somehow or other, responsible for the administration of their country now, with many mistakes, but we are doing it. It's part of a learning process.
Equatorial Guinea has a huge, huge potential. Now my worry is how many people can see this potential. And if you really want to get the most of this country, we need to give the most.
During these 50 years, we've been able to resolve the issues that were more preoccupying for us. For example, to have good hospitals, housing, employment, and a good life.
Yo creo que hemos rebatido los niveles.
I believe that no other country in the sub-region has achieved as much as we have in the 50 years that have passed since independence.
Lo ha conseguido.
Hemos trabajado mucho.
We have worked hard.
Creo que el pueblo también está satisfecho.
I believe the people are satisfied with our achievements.
El país alcance el nivel que hemos propuesto.
We must keep working for the country to reach the level we have proposed in Horizon 2020 or reschedule to Horizon 2030 so that Guinea can be an authentically self-sufficient country.
Un país autosuficiente.
On fout le mer, on part au mer, mais la lumière, et pas de mer.